Good morning. Good morning. It is my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Wonhee and Joe this morning. Dr. Joe is the professor of Christian theology and colonial studies at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. I had the privilege of having Dr. Joe for Christology when I was studying at Garrett, and it was extremely foundational and tore apart in the very best way some of the things I grew up with theology around Jesus, and allowed me to try to work on keeping something back in new ways. So first of all, thank you for that and having that experience. I'm grateful to have you here and to continue sharing with us as an extension of your work yesterday with us and ongoing work. So I introduce Dr. Joe to us. Good morning.
So this morning, I think I have a lot of options, how I've been spending time with you. And actually, I decided last minute that there is a 15-minute interview that I did for a foundation that was founded by a colleague of mine with our team, now of course, other two, where he started to interview Korean American immigrants of all generations and to keep us on track for us, for our community. And so this is a 13-minute long interview where I actually talk about a very personal journey, reflecting myself from early childhood to the adulthood, and you'll find that it's a responsive relations are very strong in class, and we are friends. So after this, I'm open to any questions, and I'd like to say a little bit about how the autobiographical is the starting point of any theology in many ways, right? And so hopefully, I can find ways to connect this to the kind of research questions, the kind of questions that I'm led to do the kind of research I do, right? And why I teach in this seminary, because they did have options to go to the university context, but I've chosen at each time to remain in that.
So my name is Wonhee and Joe. I was born in 1966, and I immigrated with my family in 1976. We landed in Las Vegas. So my mother's family was in Las Vegas, and that's how we came. So we lived there for 2 years, and then we moved to Chicago in 1978. I actually have a lot of memories of Korea for some reason, but I have fond memories of my paternal grandmother. I have memories of her in Korea, in the winter, braiding my hair and giving me this persimmon she would whip out from the back of the house somewhere. And I would be having this cold and sweet persimmon while she would braid my hair. And then later on, after we immigrated, we lived in Chicago, she came to visit us once before she passed away. She had 9 children, and 6 of them were girls, and she actually sent them all to school. And at that time, that was very unusual. And the stories are that she sold land they had behind my grandfather's back to send these girls to school. So the stories from the outside perspective was that she ruined the family by sending the girls to school. But I don't know why, but ever since I was young, hearing those stories, I was very amazed by her. Right, so we immigrated to Chicago because one of my mother's brother was here. So we basically settled down in Chicago after that. It was very racist, right? There aren't that many Asian people. Koreans were really far and scattered. So, we're talking about early 80s and late 70s, where I think Korean immigrants had also internalized sort of not self-hatred, but shame about themselves, right? So in the church, this would come out as, well, here are the educated group of people who are doctors and dentists or lawyers or what have you, or engineers. And then you had people who were the working class, janitors and dry cleaners. And for me, I noticed a lot of those tensions within my parents because they were dry cleaners. But that kind of tension and shame, mixed with self-internalized racism, were all there within the Korean American community. And I remember one event that has always stayed with me. My dad's car broke down. And so we went to the local gas station. And of course, I was translating. My father's very upset. And ever since I landed in this country, I served as an interpreter and translator. And of course, it's not just the words, but you have to get the emotions across, right? For him to feel like he had been translated. So I was doing this, and we saw a church member come to the gas station. And he happened to have been a dentist. And at the gas station, I thought he would come over and ask my father, oh, what's going on? Could we help you? Or, But here's me as a kid noticing how he avoided us in that context, right? And so this kind of disassociation that I experienced, another adult doing this. And on the other hand, I also sensed that my father felt very ashamed that I actually saw this whole thing. I look back and I think, what must he have felt, right? To know that he was being ignored and that his young daughter also saw this. He was already relying on me to translate for him, right? So I'm interested in those dynamics and the emotions that get generated from it, and how those emotions actually come through and manifest in our social relations. I think part of the immigrant story that doesn't resonate with me and have always been, in direct conflict or creating a dissonance with my experience is the class issue. The myth that, all Asian Americans are quote unquote successful, and the success is measured in a particular way, right? And modeled into the more you become assimilated, there's a kind of ease with which you achieve those, successes. The model minority myth and all that. I think there's a lot of sense of shame about the hard times we may have had, and then to know that others may be experiencing similar kind of suffering or difficult times reminds us of pretty much where we come from in some ways. And a lot of us would rather not think about that or to be reminded of it once we move away, right? Because most of our efforts are to move away from those stories because we think they're ones of shame, right, when they're really ones of our strength too. With my two boys, I've been very adamant from the beginning that I don't want them to experience the pressures of modern minority myth. Their success to me, and I want them to know all the time that their success is not about like how much money they're going to make or what kind of job they have, but are they doing something that they really feel committed to? And also, are they doing something that impacts the community, right, or the world around them? That's the kind of contribution, in fact, and if that's a pressure that I hope that they will make, is contributing to the wellness of others around them. I love teaching, and my goal is not to force ideas on people, but to bring people into conversation, even very difficult conversations, right? And when we care about each other, so Jung is important to me, right, as a teacher, or if you want to translate that as love, fine. Love becomes very important. It's the central focus of why I do what I do. And when we practice love with one another, we cannot be lazy. Actually, love is very demanding. It's very hard work. So the classroom becomes a very demanding and difficult space because if we start with the premise, we love each other, we love one another, we should be able to tap into these most difficult conversations. So for me, I become as vulnerable as the students to each time. So it's a journey that we go on for the semester. So intellectually, it's also demanding and rigorous. Emotionally, just as demanding as rigorous. I don't think you could separate those two apart. They go together. And any meaningful transformation that begins to take place with one another begins by listening to one another, by being willing, being open to be transformed by the other, by the demands of the other, by the pains of other, by their strengths. My hope is that I do hold that space as still a place where we practice love. In Zhang, there's no choice. Zhang just happens. It's very generative, and it gets generated between relations. And whether it's one of enemy or friend, Zhang just can happen, right? It's sort of outside of our control. It's relation's own power to generate an emotion between the two. And so for me, I'm very much interested in that kind of care and relation of love. It's a different kind of love. When we decolonize love, we should be able to say there are different forms of love around the world. And Zhang is one particular way of love. So there's multiple languages of love. And that's what we need to bring to the fore, to the front of our attention. So in some ways, the more practices of love, different languages of love, ways of love that we have, I think, the more deeper understanding, even the Western notion of love will be deepened and expanded. It was difficult. I mean, I think, separations and divorces are never an easy thing, right? It's sort of you reach a point of no turning back, so that takes place. It was really difficult for me. I had never thought I would be in that situation. I became very resentful that the church is unable to account for, children who don't necessarily live with their mom and their dad. So that kind of structural stuff that's in place, that's normative, is something that I began to really challenge and question. It was not easy, but I do realize that, doing these experiences for me as a woman, my feminism became even more sharpened. There's a point in which, yes, being a mother is very important, being a daughter is very important, but I also had to make claims to myself, right? Who I was before I was their mother. And also to really see, it's like patriarchy with its gloves off. So the difficult part of that process of divorcing wasn't actually divorce from Day. It was actually the external people around me, right? The other men who felt that because I was not in relation with a husband now, I was husbandless. And so they felt they could actually behave whichever way they wanted with me. So it was quite disappointing. It was really difficult. I became very isolated from the other Korean American communities because, again, there's still a stigma about that. And for me, it was really important to sort of stand tall and do what I do, especially because I'm in theology, right? It's the more conservative, and among Korean Christians, right? It's sort of the divorce sort of discredits me from being a theologian. And so, how do I stand tall? I know it might sound really interesting, but I absolutely have no fear anymore. Once you spit on the face of patriarchy and they're done with you, it's like, well, I'm done with you too, right? Yeah. And it's actually been quite liberating. I'm more and more aware as a mother of 2 Korean American men, and also, thinking of Day as well. In the context of white supremacy, like in this white culture, this racist culture, how we are differently racialized, the men from women, and the kind of sort of the hetero masculinity the kind of white hetero masculinity that they have to embody to be considered quote unquote real men, is something that I've had to really work through, and part of me really hurt for my boys that they live in this context, right, where they have to strive so hard to be men, particular kind of men. On the other hand, the world is changing, and I'm really glad it's changing, right? And they feel much more comfortable in their skin and in their sexuality. But I realize sometimes, how difficult it must be, being a Korean American man in this context. I went through a real hard time when we were in Oklahoma, with my older son, because it was a new context for him and all the racism and what have you. And, he was going through a hard time. And there's a metaphor that has always stayed with me it occurred to me, one night. And it was, I didn't know how to help my son, who was struggling so hard, right? But it felt like we were caught in wave after wave in the ocean. And the only thing I could do for him is not let go of his hand in that ocean, right? But to ride through the waves with him. That's all I could do. And to me, even today, that image stays with me about parenting when you go through difficult times. I want them to know that I'm still here. That's the only thing that I could do, right? Is to let them know I'm here, just reach out or something. I can't solve everything, but I'm here. My name is Wonhee and Jo, and this is my Korean American story.
I can share that video with you as photos of my relations that my children saw and my mother and father. I can say that that was filmed before the pandemic. Not really much has changed, except that I continue to really explore what it means to be in the context of the United States, right? Experience of United States as a colonial state, as a state that the conditions of its possibility was really dependent on kind of a white structure, whiteness, right? Europeanness, what have you, and giving birth to, at the same time, anti-Black structure, right? And, where do the Asians fall? And often there's a sort of a myth that Asians are new immigrants, right? But actually it's true that Asian immigration goes really far back, further than what many people think, right? And in particular for Koreans, it was actually very closely tied with the church, with the missionaries, right? The first migrant workers, Korean workers came to Hawaii, and the brokers were missionaries who only stocked on sugar plantation in Hawaii. So they wanted laborers, they wanted to convert people, but they happened to be poor folks who really needed money. So they chose to go to Hawaii's sugar plantations for cheap labor. And so the collusion, right, of the church and missionary activity in Korea, I mean, there's also the positive part too, the colonial dimension is there. And the way that, as I shared yesterday with the way that Civil Rights Act was passed in this time period, the Immigration Act, really situated us historically, politically, socially, so that anti-Blackness is offered with actually anti-Asian rhetoric that is disguised as kind of alliance with Asians, right? White proximity to Asian. And sometimes, a lot of Koreans in particular buy into this because we have a long history of U.S. military presence in Korea that also taught us a racial hierarchy in the U.S., right? That we witnessed firsthand during the Korean War, the racial hierarchy, even though it was a desegregated U.S. military in Korea, there was segregated work, right? And we saw what the work was. And so some sociologists argue that Korean immigrants actually learned American brand racism before we came. Right. So all of these things that you saw here, race, gender, sexuality, class, have led me to a lot of questions. So I actually went to seminary for my MDiv first year because it wasn't really my choice. I still have a good daughter syndrome. My father was the youngest of 7 children. or 9 children. And he actually, as I share, my grandmother sent all the daughters to school in Kathy, but my father, by the time they got to my dad, there was nothing left to send them to school. So, and given the times that he was in, he didn't go to school, and that was his lifelong thing about, becoming a pastor, and he never did, right? So he really drilled into me, even though he was a real patriarchal person, women should be submissive. At the same time, it was why don't you go to seminary and become a pastor? So I grew up with these very, dissonant voices at the same time. So as you could tell, I've been translating for him ever since I came to the US 6 months later. And so, part of that was still with me. And I went to seminary thinking after 1 year I was going to leave. I actually through that year took the LSAT and prepare myself to go to law school. But when I was in seminary, I realized that a lot of the questions that I had, the dissonance that I had, were not so dissonant, right? My father, as I mentioned, was very patriarchal, even more so with my mother. But he took me to protest to the streets to try to bring to there. Because in the 80s, there was a lot of political upheaval taking place in Korea, and he was part of the democratic movement, very active there. His oldest brother was tortured and killed in front of the family during the Japanese occupation underground movements. So there's a long history in his family. So I realized during seminary that, these political stuff that were sort of floating in the family and the religious Christian patriarchal stuff, the class, all of these were actually interconnected. And I begin to ask the theological questions, right? How is it that the God of love permits this to take place? Or how can we, who are practitioners of this, bear witness to these forms of suffering that continue. And so I kept digging away on the questions, and so I got into stage in seminary. And from there, the questions became even more critical for me. So I went into the PhD program. So most of my research actually had maybe 2 or 3 interdisciplinary dimensions, but feminism is a given for me. Race, the analysis of race construction is important to me. History, right? History and colonialism is important to me. And going back to feminism has become a huge factor for me because race and sexism, I think, share a common denominator that is also economic structure, right? So that's there. The other dimension is I studied a lot in psychoanalysis because I was also interested in. So we have these social political structures. How does it affect our mind, right? And part of it was I went into therapy to ask the question, why do I do that? Where does it come from, right? I think I also wanted to understand that how, because in many ways our faith relies a lot in terms of our heart, right? And I think that there's no amount of explanation that could somehow convert my heart to something, right? And I wanted to understand how does one's mind, one's heart convert? In a way, we need conversion, right? So that's where I'm at. I'm currently, the project that I've been working on has all of these dimensions, but it ends with a ritual that I'm beginning to study, and this is the Korean ritual known as Jepa. And this is the ancestor memorial service that we usually do collectively. When Koreans became Christians, they were forbidden from doing this by the missionaries because they understood the practice as idolatrous, as if we were quote unquote worshiping our ancestors, but it is a remembrance of our ancestors. And we hold ancestors and spirits with high regard, with all seriousness. And for me, the project looks at that as perhaps a possible ritual for Christians as well, the remembering of our ancestors, and the question, of being haunted by our ancestors, being on a journey with our ancestors continuously. The saints go with us. So that's the current project. If you have questions from the video or from the last two lectures, please feel free to
It's time in the back of my mind since elections yesterday, trying to better define the delineation between colonial and post-colonial, especially after the race where we want yesterday. If colonialism leaves in its wake, local people who are moving to like then as and I guess I'd like you to comment further on that delineation of what it means. Is there ever most
Sure. I think a lot of the theories struggle with the question, right? So for me, I use it as a hermeneutic lens to begin to say, well, the post-colonial isn't really here, right? But because technically, politically, we have sovereignties of nation states. So fortunately, we are in that post-colonial. The colonialism continues. One dimension, one evidence of this that you're sort of alluding to, in the Korean church, if I were to speak about the ancestor remembrance ritual, I would be considered a heretic in most cases. Because let's say Korean Presbyterians in Korea are more Presbyterian than the ones in Scotland. This is how colonialism works, right? You have self-internalized, sort of you're over-determined from the outside, everything about you and your history, right? And just to pull out of that this tremendous work of decolonization, and it's not a moment, it doesn't happen in one event, it's a lifelong process of decolonizing, right? Sometimes in churches, during communion service, they'll use the rice wine and the rice cake. Even that alone will cause a frenzy. Right? And the very most sort of the radical theologians in Korea, the Minju theologians, the liberation movement in Korea would do this, right? Not in the mainline church. Because the mainline church still wants to mimic what they feel is the real, authentic tradition, and this tends to be European, right? So, as you mentioned, in the wake of colonialism, there's actually a wonderful book titled "In the Wake" by an African American scholar, Christina Sharp, and she talks about the use of the term in the wake of slavery, in the wake of the transatlantic journey, right? In the wake of police brutality, the wake work that we have to do, right? You have to be awake to do the work of mourning. So the wake work continues in the midst of colonialism. Whatever the host may be, it continues.
Can you speak more about the ritual and mourning that you're talking about?
So let me spell it. It's JESA. I think that's how they spell it in my book proposal text. That is Chesa. And usually families do this in relation to their loved ones who passed away on the day of their death, right? They could do this. Or do the annual fall harvesting day, right? The very big holiday when families get together, they do this. But this too is very effective because the women prepare all the meals. But they cannot stand in front of the table to bow to the ancestors. Right? So part of what I'm trying to challenge in the current book is, really doing a deconstruction of this patriarchal dimension and bringing it to the church on a sort of a more egalitarian practice. And actually, the Jewish tradition that was part of what became Christianity allows me to make that leap, surprisingly, because again, the story of the women, right, at the tomb, what they have done, the Jewish funerary rituals were actually women-led as well, right, and sustained by women for days. And so I'm trying to, and there's a good book that allows me to do this by Kathleen O'Connor. I believe she is a feminist biblical scholar on her book called Maranatha, where she looks at the funerary rituals and women's role in that. But right now, families do it, but it tends to be quote unquote non-Christians, even in Korea. So I'd like to bring that into the Christian space, but not just to the nuclear family part, but to a public space, even to the street, right? And to church collectives.
I guess I have one question, being a Korean Christian. The Korean church is unique in the world because it is the one church that was established not by colonialists, but Korea was colonized by a non-Christian, country. I just wonder how that works in your understanding of being a Korean Christian.
Well, right now about 21% in Korea are still Buddhist, right? And I believe like 7% are Christian. But surprisingly, when they come to the US, most of them convert to Christianity. So becoming American means becoming Christian, right? In Korean history, though, we are occupied by Japan, and Shintoism was everywhere. So when the Japanese occupation ended, Shintoism was brought down. There were some missionary activities before that, American missionary activity vis-a-vis China to Korea. But Korean Christianity began to take off after the Korean War, and this happens with Billy Graham, right? And so American evangelical fundamentalism is closely connected with the rise of Christianity in Korea. And so they are actually very intimately linked. And of course, shrouding all this is the Cold War politics and the ascendancy of U.S. power in the global scale. There's a book that just came out by a Korean American historian called Race or Revival. So it's how American evangelicalism, the way it is today, was only possible with the evangelical movement in Korea. So they rose together. But in the history textbooks, American evangelicalism actually erases Korea. So she's making the connection and she's bringing those names back by going through the documents and archives. What's really interesting, though, is that that evangelicalism is very racialized. Billy Graham worked very closely with the administration and with the CIA. So if you look at a lot of the documents of that time, he has a lot of anti-Black rhetoric in his work, right? I actually had to talk to a student who did Billy Graham dissertation and detection of CIA and anti-Black racism. And so imagine that also then transporting, right, to Korea and having its theological inflection there, right? So in many ways, the racialization of Koreans happened, get even more intimately connected with white evangelical Christianity. So it then is not surprising that, we want to be more liked than white Americans here. The other thing too is that after that though, Helen Kim's point is that actually Koreans want to even supersede American evangelicalism. So they want to outpace the growth of American evangelicalism, and then they are the most sending country now of missionaries in the world. Right? Yes. So it's colonialism coming to bite people's ass. It's really serious, right? And what it does is it really refers to the dynamic that has often happened. I think particularly in many church dynamics, people will say, "Oh, those people in Africa or all those people in Korea are more homophobic or are more racist or more primitive or more fundamentalist, not progressive like us." And part of it is, no, this is your kin, your evangelical counterparts who actually had a hand in that formation. Right. It's very messy. It's very messy. Yes.
So I have a question, a little bit off topic, so we can shut it down if you need to. I have a number of people, so I think most people here were probably around in the 70s and 80s in the demographic. There were a lot of Korean adoptions during that time. And now, some of the people that I work with daily are those adoptees, and they get questions like, "Where are you from?" And they're like, "Well, Madison." No, really, where are you from? No, the West Side. I mean, what are you looking for? But there's just still some that feeling that somehow you're supposed to be something different than you are. And I don't know if you've done any work about, say, an immigrant versus an adoptee and how they're adapting, things like that.
Sure. So that's actually another emerging and growing field is transnational adoption studies. And the country that actually sends out most adoptees is Korea too. And this should not be a surprise, actually, because it begins during the Korean War and shortly after. Part of our reconstruction effort as a government was sending our children out. And part of these were, children who were given to orphanages. Sometimes children were actually taken forcefully because it was a very much money-making project at that time it began. The other part of it was that Christianity gets inflected into this. So many of you might know one of the major adoption agency has Christian inflections and also really begins Korea as the first site of the adoption programs. So a lot of children were sent and continues to be sent. Part of the reason too why this happens is it's not that they're all mixed race children. There are a lot of Korean children as well who are being sent forth. But as long as the U.S. military stays in Korea, that adoption line will always stay open and available. Korean military right now is also the chief of staff of Republic of Korea. So the Korean president cannot declare war. Right? It's a U.S. military general. They've been like this for over 72 years now. Okay, so that means militarism is a huge money-making project in Korea. They get the best real estate. And what this means is that it's not that the Korean War veterans who return continuously voice their son of age are sent to Korea and still have the rhetoric, they're out there saving Koreans. Right? So the race, the gender language is really solidified. Same thing from communism or So, communism versus democracy, that Cold War rhetoric is completely saturated in Korean politics today.
Very seems to me, a lot of things are overcome. You go north of 30 parallel, you literally come into the convention of American news, the convention of American thought. When people talk about Korea, they generally don't say it, but they use South Korea. What efforts are there and how can we promote reunify?
Thank you. So that question is very dear to my heart and to my family. It's also part of the current research. So the historical situation that I looked at is the Korean War. My father, he was born and raised in the South, but to him, Korea is one. When he was able, he, as an American citizen, was allowed to visit North Korea vis-a-vis Beijing. So he makes, he's made a lot of trips there. For him, there is no North and South. He still wears on his lapel, one Korea. And that is his dream. I would like to say that after 72 years, there are people, like I said, because of colonialism and colonial psyche state, many are indoctrinated to feel that North Korea is communist. They still refer to it as a red state, that it's evil, it's not Christian, it's not democratic, right? I mean, when you have Bush refer to it as one of the acts of evil, it is very deep in the psyche. What many don't realize is that there was never a 38th parallel. That was constructed by external sources, and that if you didn't make it across a certain, space, geographical space, right, when that line was became official, some people have families who are north. They don't know if they're passed away, if they're still alive. They left some parents who couldn't take that, walking journey in a rush. It's a small state, like the state of Illinois, right? So you are separated for how many decades and still separate. You don't know whether you ever go back to your home, your hometown. You don't know what happened to these family members. There are attempts by past, South Korean administration to do these meetups, right? So they have those, and it just tears you apart, right? And even then, there's a lot of it's very broad politically, and you don't know who's being surveilled, who's not, and what have you, right? There are movements, surprisingly, there's some movements in Korea, but I think sometimes it takes distance to begin the work of sort of the activist work, right, of even dreaming about North Korea. And so you do have groups in the diaspora, and they're actually all women-led. Korea Peace is one. Women Across DMV is another one. And these two organizations that I'm part of work towards this dream of one day unified Korea. Right? We don't know the details, right, of what form governance that may be, or if that is impossible, or it could be too safe, right? I mean, Israel Palestine always talks about this kind of stuff too, right? Different kind of governance, but at least would it be possible to drive over, right? Can I drive 15 minutes to my hometown, right? So I think this is a kind of a longing, a yearning that Koreans have. But according to my father, he's really not sure if South Korea is actually capable at this point. He doesn't put the burden on North Korea, but it's on South Korea because we have been so, we have identified so much with U.S. imperialism. We did some dirty work for the United States. Some of you may not be aware, Koreans and Vietnamese don't have really good relations. And part of this is that during the Vietnam War, Korea was the allied country that sent the most soldiers, because Koreans conscripted the poorest of the poor men to go to Vietnam. And in Vietnam, Korean conscripted soldiers did worse things than US soldiers there. And Korean government received hefty financial funding for this. Of course, the soldiers who went there did not see a penny of that money, but Korea did receive like millions, hundreds of millions of money continuously. They were financed, right? And this is part of the reason why Korea also was able to recreate the war, great, of course, but we have the structural support to rise economically in Asia, geographic region. There's a reason for that. So I have a Filipino friend who says, the minute that Filipinos cut those ties with the US in many ways, our funding stopped and we just couldn't develop anymore. And because at one point, the Philippines was richer than Korea. And so because it's an English speaking also, Korean students used to go to the Philippines to study, right? And now it's like the reverse. And a lot of it again has to do with some of the patronage of the multiplicity of US bases. The more you host, right, the most you become allied militarily, the more funding that you receive too. So, and again, the question is, where is the Christian church in all this, if at all?
Let me just go back to something that you were talking about before, which is remembrance of ancestors and how it varies across different countries and different religions. And I don't think in America we have very good conditions to remember ancestors, for one thing. But also that in Korea, you remember all of your ancestors. I mean, the saints and the sinners. There's one appreciating the difficult, challenging person who was, perhaps in prison or suicide. Because here in America, I shouldn't say here in America. There are a lot of people who are really into Ancestry.com, going back and figure out who your ancestors are. But they usually want to figure out the ones who were really successful. And not, Uncle Joe. But how does others?
I'm not sure how Korea has done it, apart from it being a family situation. In the family context, you remember everyone who's passed away, right? I know in the public sphere, again, this women-led group, the comfort women, quote unquote, the girls that have been, conscripted to the Japanese military for sexual labor, when those girls, women who are now grandmothers, when they passed away, part of it is that they become a figure of national shame, right? Because Korea was disempowered, this happened, and in many ways the blame falls on these women, right? Or you didn't have enough family support, you didn't have, right? It's the usual stuff, the usual rhetoric. So they're kind of shame shrouding all that, and we'd rather not really bring it to the public sphere. But women activists wanted to go do away with that. So they made figures of a girl, right? And they placed it right in front of the Japanese consulate in Korea. And they held vigils there every Wednesday for almost 3 years. Right? And then they created another figure that traveled all over the world. Right? So that becomes a kind of ancestral remembering ritual that is public, in the public domain, right? And creates different forms of remembering for us. As a Christian, I have to say this, you can choose who you want to remember or not. We can choose it. He was executed outside the holy city. He didn't get to die in the city. He was kicked out of the city. So in that context, you have to remember that the walls of the city made a dividing line. between the barbers out there and the civilized and lawful inside. He died outside of the city gates. He was killed on the cross. And for Jews, that was the most shameful way to die. Right? So what does it mean that we remember Jesus who died on the cross in the most shameful way? Right? And then, most likely, according to historians, and you all know, because you had Dominic Cross in here too, probably, that they forbade the body from being taken down. Right? They wanted his body to be eaten by the birds and left to the dogs. Because they didn't even want any remains of the body left to be taken for burial. Right? So he was considered a criminal. So what does that mean? That should shift the perspective we have about our ancestors, right?
A different direction, just thinking about straddling cultures and identities and where the comfort level is or isn't about being completely part of either. My kids grew up in Germany. We were working for the military. And they found that when we came to visit, they weren't quite comfortable here, they weren't quite comfortable there. Because, well, how it is. So, being a person in this country, American person, and yet treated as other, and also being in Korea and not really quite fitting in either place. That whole experience, not just personally, but for people who either are immigrating or are straddling identities and cultures. Is anything about that?
Oh, I can say a lot about that. And I guess we tie in with the adoption question too. The way that Asian Americans are racialized in the US is through this idea of what we call perpetual foreigner. Right? So you don't hear people say, "Where are you from?" to a Black person. Right? Well, they'll say to the Asian, because we're always foreigners. We're never fully integrated here. That it doesn't matter what generation or how fluent you are in English, or if you were born in Morristown, New York. Okay, you get asked, "So where are you from?" Right? And that question means you are not from here. Right? You're even though you're a citizen by birth or you're third generation, you still get asked. Right? You exactly. And so again, if you're Black, you look different from the Black dominant group, but you don't get asked that. Because when you ask a Black person that, what you brought us on a slave ship. And this is going to go back on that, right? But with Asians, they create this notion of the perpetual foreigner, and the only way that you could sort of be behind this perpetual foreigner tag on you is if you assimilate into whiteness, right? To the point that you emulate another idea or notion that is a model minority. The model minority is a successful one who does not disturb any social order, does not call for any accountability, and fades and becomes invisible. The nice Asian, right? The nice Asian. The Asian that will leave your sensibilities intact. The other dominant person who's asking the question intact. I think Koreans are all over the diaspora outside of Korea, so not just the US, but Europe, Latin America, what have you. And many of us struggle with this identity. So I think for me, the identity is very hybrid. What's really interesting is that how I see myself as a Korean American is not monolithic nor singular. So my their understanding of being Korean American is also very different, right? One common denominator is that they get asked too, so where are you from? They were born in Morristown, right? And there's they still get asked this question. When US and Korea came together for a soccer match that one year, they were very young, and we were all watching and everything. So I was teasing them like, "So who are you rooting for? The US team or the Korean?" And they just turned and looked at me and said, "Korea, of course." So that was kind of interesting, right? That even in them, that there is still some unrelinquishment when it comes to Korea, right? So, that's one thing. As I get older, it's less of a straddling thing for me. When I go home after this weekend, I will probably make, typical Korean food, kimchi stew. And I'll have that with rice. And I'll do that in front of Korean drama while I'm watching Korean drama. Now, I've been here since 1976, so it's over 40 years. I've tried to make sense of it. I've tried to adapt, and I don't even speak Korean that well. But the older I get, my home becomes a sanctuary. I am tired when I walk out of my door. I put on a persona, not a persona in a bad way, but I embraced anything can happen. I'm a food professor at Madison. I could be asked where you came from, or the other one, go back to where you came from. What do you do with that? When you have a Northwestern student, if in the midst of all the COVID stuff, the anti-Asian stuff, you're walking down the street, right? Go back to where you came from. How can I respond to that? Right? Yes. And so I feel that when I go outside the door, I am always braced. It's tiring, it's exhausting. So my home is curated purposely with Korean paints and scrolls that my father has brought back from North Korea. When I go to Korea, I bring things that will help me preserve a space that I could be my most, vulnerable self. I want it to smell like Korea, right? I want this beauty to remind me of the mountains that I grew up in Korea. And that's where I'm at. I'm not sure, when I pass away, I'll be buried here. I don't know what that means. I'll be buried here probably because it's easy access for my kids if they ever want to come see me somewhere. But I wish I was back in Korea in the mountains. I grew up for 9 years of my life in the southern part of Korea. I made a journey there right before the pandemic, and for 1 week I had to rent a car and I drove by myself through the farmlands that I remember. To the ocean, to the mountains, the mountain top where I moved down to the ocean and see all the rice paddies, the rice fields in the fall. And I felt I came home. And on that journey, my father happened to be out in Korea, and we didn't plan on meeting up or anything because he was busy with his stuff. And he said, "I want you to meet me in this town." I go, "Oh gosh, that's so funny. Why?" He said, "I need to introduce you." So I was like, okay. So I go there and we have to walk up this mountain path. It's beautiful, and we get to this space of tall pine trees and I see tombstones. And there's big round, area around. And the caretaker was there and he said, "This is the Joe family. Like it's family cemetery." So we go to the biggest, I go back to generations, and he introduces me. That's when he needed to introduce me to him. That we started with an apology. "I'm sorry it took so long," basically, and said, "I finally brought my daughter." So, and it wasn't like all these spaces of sacred, like you can't say like, we were like walking on top of these mountains and just being real friendly at home. And I walked away feeling I finally came home. So it was a very, very spiritual experience for me. I don't know how, I'm still trying to articulate all of the dimensions to that experience. Because I'm still affectively in that space. And I'm struggling with, what does it mean that, I've never met, and I don't know any of them for generations. I've been away. It's my first time in my entire life that I go before these ancestors and I'm introduced and I vow, right? And I return. So there's some kind of power there that that exceed my intelligence at the time. So, but it is something that's that I'm trying to tie in with a bit more precision in my work on the chess style practice.
Being that we're out of time, I want to thank you, Dr. Jane, for sharing your journey with us. We are so glad that you're doing brought you to us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for hearing my story. So I hope my story might also kind of nudge you into thinking about your story too, if you haven't.
Thank you. Next week, we're going to have the very honorable Pastor Mark is going to be speaking to us about sharing his journey. So please join us next week.